The Arizona desert heat made the air shimmer like water, distorting everything beyond 1,000 yards into a rippling mirage. Captain Sarah Mitchell stood at the edge of the firing line, her hands moving with the precision of a surgeon as she adjusted her rifle scope. Sweat trickled down her spine, but her fingers remained steady despite the 104-degree inferno that had turned the Yuma proving ground into a blast furnace. The smell of gun oil and hot sand filled her nostrils. Around her, the world's best military marksmen prepared their equipment, each movement deliberate, professional. That's when she heard the voice that would ignite everything. "Wrong gun, sweetheart." The words cut through the desert air like a knife. Sarah didn't need to turn around to identify the speaker. She'd recognize that cocky Texas drawl anywhere. Staff Sergeant Derek Haynes had been circling her like a predator since she'd arrived at the International Military Marksmanship Competition 3 days ago, always watching, always smirking, waiting for his moment to strike. And now, with cameras rolling and competitors gathering, he'd found it. Sarah's fingers continued their methodical work, adjusting the parallax on her scope with micro-precision, but her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The rifle in her hands was a custom-built monster, a precision weapon chambered in .338 Lapua Magnum that looked like it had been designed to stop elephants, not hit paper targets. 12 pounds of cold steel and carbon fiber that kicked like an angry mule and sounded like thunder when it spoke. The recoil could bruise ribs, and the muzzle blast was so intense it kicked up dust in a 10-foot radius. Most shooters at the competition had chosen lighter calibers, 308 Winchester, 6.5 Creedmoor, weapons with less recoil, more forgiving platforms that allowed for faster follow-up shots and easier handling. Haynes sauntered closer, his Army combat uniform somehow still crisp and pressed despite the oppressive heat, his smile sharper than broken glass and twice as dangerous. He was a big man, 6'3", 220 pounds of muscle and swagger, with the kind of square jaw and broad shoulders that looked like they'd been carved from granite. His reputation preceded him. 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq, confirmed kills in double digits, and a trophy case full of shooting medals that would make most marksmen weep with envy. He was good, and he knew it. More importantly, he wanted everyone else to know it too. "That cannon's gonna knock you on your ass, darling," Haynes continued, his voice carrying across the range with theatrical clarity. He was playing to an audience now, and he knew exactly how to work a crowd. "Why don't you switch to something you can actually handle? Maybe a nice .223, something with a little less authority." He emphasized the last word with a condescending smile that made Sarah's blood simmer. The laughter started then, rolling through the assembled shooters like thunder before a storm. It wasn't cruel exactly, more like the reflexive chuckle men make when one of their own makes a joke at someone else's expense. 15 nations had sent their best marksmen to this competition, Germans with their legendary precision, British soldiers with Olympic medals, Canadians known for their long-range prowess, Australians whose sniper tradition went back to Gallipoli. Elite shooters, every one of them. And now they were all watching the show, watching the only woman on the firing line, getting dressed down by the American Army's golden boy. Sarah finally turned to face Haynes, moving with deliberate slowness. Her gray eyes, the color of storm clouds over Montana mountains, fixed on him with an intensity that should have melted steel. She was 33 years old, 5'6", and weighed 140 pounds soaking wet. Standing next to Haynes, she looked like a child beside a bear. Her dark hair was pulled back in a regulation bun. Her Marine Corps uniform bore the sweat stains of 3 hours in the desert sun, and her hands showed the calluses and scars of 15 years behind a rifle. She looked small, unremarkable, forgettable. That was Haynes's first mistake, thinking that size mattered when it came to pulling a trigger. "I appreciate your concern, Staff Sergeant," she said, her voice honey-smooth with an edge of Montana steel underneath, the kind of polite that was somehow more cutting than an insult. "But I chose this rifle for a reason." Each word was measured, controlled, delivered with the same precision she applied to her shooting. No emotion, no anger, just a statement of fact. "Oh yeah," Haynes grinned wider, encouraged by the attention, playing it up for the cameras that had started to drift in their direction. A CNN crew, a British documentary team, even a YouTuber with a massive following, they all sensed drama and came running like sharks to blood in the water. And what reason is that? Trying to prove something. He emphasized the word something in a way that stripped away any ambiguity about what he meant. Trying to prove she belonged here. Trying to prove women could compete with men. Trying to prove she wasn't just a diversity checkbox, a political statement wrapped in camouflage, a social experiment playing out on the firing line. The implication hung in the air, heavy and toxic. Around them, the laughter had died down, replaced by an uncomfortable silence as the other shooters realized they'd stumbled into something bigger than just friendly trash talk. This was about more than one competition, one shot, one rifle. This was about every woman who'd ever been told she didn't belong, every female soldier who'd had to fight twice as hard for half the recognition, every barrier that had been placed in Sarah's path for 15 years. Sarah held his gaze for a long, loaded moment. She could have responded, could have listed her qualifications, her deployments, her confirmed kills in Afghanistan, her scores that had shattered range records. Could have mentioned that this wrong gun had put down enemy combatants at 1,400 yards in Helmand Province while Haynes was still stateside teaching basic marksmanship. Could have reminded him that she'd graduated Scout Sniper School, the same course he'd failed on his first attempt, and finished second in her class. But she didn't, because she'd learned long ago that the best response to men like Derek Haynes wasn't argument, it was excellence. It was letting the work speak when words would only be dismissed. She turned back to her rifle without another word. The dismissal was deliberate, calculated, more devastating than any comeback. She resumed her equipment check as if he simply didn't exist, as if his opinion carried no more weight than the wind. But as she bent over her scope, she heard him mutter, just loud enough for everyone to hear, just soft enough to maintain plausible deniability. This is what happens when they start lowering standards. The words hit like a physical blow, but Sarah's hands never wavered. She'd heard variations of this same comment for 15 years, at boot camp in her units, at every school, every assignment, every competition. The assumption that her presence meant degraded excellence, that her achievements were participation trophies, that she was here because of politics rather than performance. It never stopped hurting. She'd just gotten better at hiding the pain. The competition official's voice suddenly boomed across the range through the loudspeaker system, cutting through the tension like a rescue flare. "Shooters, your attention. Today's final event has been officially announced." The crowd hushed instantly, conversations dying mid-sentence. This was what everyone had been waiting for, the signature challenge of the 50th anniversary competition, the event that would separate legends from mere experts. The ultimate test will be a 2,000-yard shot. The official paused for dramatic effect, letting the number sink in. 2,000 yards, that was over a mile, farther than most people could see clearly with the naked eye. At that distance, a human being looked like a speck of dust, taken from a standing position, completely unsupported. The silence that followed was absolute, so complete that Sarah could hear the wind whistling through the distant target frames. Then chaos erupted. "That's impossible," someone shouted from the back. "This is insane. Publicity stunt. Nobody can make that shot." The complaints rolled through the crowd like a wave, shooters shaking their heads, laughing in disbelief, checking their phones to see if this was some kind of joke. Most military snipers never engaged targets beyond 1,500 yards in combat, and those shots were taken prone with bipods, sandbags, every mechanical advantage physics and engineering could provide. Standing meant no support, no stability except what your own body could generate. It meant your heartbeat became the enemy, every muscle tremor translated into inches of deviation at the target, every breath a potential disaster. But Sarah Mitchell wasn't looking at the complainers. Her eyes had gone distant, unfocused. the way they always did when she was calculating. Wind speed and direction, temperature and humidity, altitude and air pressure, the Coriolis effect of the Earth's rotation. At 2,000 yards, you weren't just fighting the target, you were fighting the planet itself. The bullet would be in flight for nearly 3 full seconds, traveling through constantly shifting air currents, losing velocity with every inch, dropping over 60 feet from the bore line due to gravity alone. And she'd have to do it standing up, holding 12 pounds of rifle steady while her heart beat 70 times per minute, while her lungs expanded and contracted, while her muscles quivered microscopically with the effort of perfect stillness. The corners of her mouth turned up in the smallest of smiles, barely visible but unmistakable to anyone watching closely. Impossible. That's what they'd said about women in the infantry, about female Marines in combat roles, about her making it through Scout Sniper School, about her earning a place on this team. Impossible was just another word for hasn't been done yet. And Sarah Mitchell had built her entire career on doing things that hadn't been done yet. She glanced sideways at Derek Haynes, who was staring at the target in the distance with a mixture of excitement and concern on his face. He caught her looking, and that cocky smile returned. "Gonna be fun watching you try that with your right gun, Captain," he said, loading her rank with just enough emphasis to make it sound like an insult instead of respect. Sarah didn't respond. She just returned to her rifle, her mind already running through the calculations, the preparations, the 10,000 hours of practice that had brought her to this moment. In 3 days, she would step up to that firing line. In 3 days, the whole world would be watching. In 3 days, she would either make history or become a cautionary tale. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like coming home. 25 years earlier, in the mountains of western Montana, an 8-year-old girl lay in the dirt beside her father, cheek pressed against the stock of a .22 rifle that was almost as long as she was tall. The morning air was crisp and cold, smelling of pine and earth, and frost still clung to the grass in shadowed patches. Above them, the big sky stretched endless and blue, the kind of sky that made you believe anything was possible. "Breathe out slow, baby girl," her father whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind rustling through the lodgepole pines. "Find that quiet place between heartbeats. That's where the magic lives." Staff Sergeant Robert Mitchell, retired Marine Corps, had the patience of a saint and the teaching instincts of a natural instructor. He'd learned to shoot in these same mountains as a boy, and now he was passing the tradition to his daughter like a sacred inheritance. Sarah squeezed the trigger with steady pressure the way he'd taught her. The rifle cracked, sharp and clean in the mountain silence. 300 yards away, across the meadow where wildflowers would bloom in summer, a tin can jumped off the fence post and clattered to the ground. Her father let out a low whistle, the sound mixing pride and disbelief. "I'll be damned. That's 5 for 5, Sarah." He looked at his daughter with something like wonder dawning in his weathered eyes. "Baby girl, I think you might have a gift." But gifts come with prices, and Sarah learned that truth early and hard. While other girls in her elementary school class passed notes about which boy was cutest and planned slumber parties where they'd paint their nails and giggle about crushes, Sarah spent her weekends on the range with her father. She learned to calculate wind drift by watching grass bend. She learned to read mirage through a scope, to estimate distance by the size of objects, to control her breathing until her heart rate dropped below 50 beats per minute. By age 10, she could field strip and reassemble a rifle blindfolded. By 12, she was beating grown men at local shooting competitions. The first time she won, she was competing against ranchers and hunters who'd been shooting since before she was born. They'd laughed when she stepped up to the line, this skinny girl with pigtails and a rifle that looked too big for her frame. They stopped laughing when she put 10 shots through a 2-inch group at 500 yards. One old-timer, a Vietnam vet with hands like leather and eyes like flint, shook her hand afterward. "Girl shoots like the devil himself taught her," he said, and Sarah wasn't sure if it was a compliment or an accusation. School was torture in its own way. She didn't fit anywhere. Too tomboyish for the popular girls, too serious for the athletic crowd, too different for anyone to quite know what to do with her. She ate lunch alone most days, reading gun magazines and ballistics manuals while other kids gossiped and flirted. Her mother, Linda Mitchell, watched with growing concern as her daughter drifted further from conventional girlhood. "Sarah, honey, don't you want to try out for cheerleading? Or maybe join the drama club?" But Sarah had already found her passion, and it didn't involve pom-poms or stage makeup. At 16, sitting at the dinner table on a Tuesday night with meatloaf getting cold on her plate, Sarah made her announcement. "I'm joining the Marines when I turn 18. The silence that followed was deafening. Her mother's fork clattered onto her plate. Her father went very still, his eyes searching her face. "Sarah," her mother finally said, her voice tight with barely controlled panic, "that's not. Girls don't. Why would you want to do that?" But Sarah's jaw was set with the same determination her father recognized from the shooting range. "Because I want to serve. Because I want to be the best at something that matters. Because—" She paused, searching for words to explain the fire that burned in her chest. "Because I need to know what I'm capable of." Her mother cried for a week straight. Her father said nothing for 3 days, just watched his daughter with those calculating eyes. Finally, he pulled her aside. "You know it's going to be harder for you than it would be for a boy. You know they're going to doubt you every single day." "I know," Sarah said simply. "You know you're going to have to be twice as good to get half the credit." "I know." Her father nodded slowly, then did something unexpected. He smiled. "Then let's make sure you're twice as good." For the next 2 years, until she shipped out to boot camp, they trained with intensity that bordered on obsession. 5 a.m. runs in the mountains, carrying weighted packs until her legs screamed, pull-ups until her hands bled, shooting drills in rain, snow, heat, and wind. Her father pushed her harder than he'd ever pushed anyone, and she never complained, never quit, never asked for mercy. Because she understood what he was preparing her for: war. Not just the war she might fight overseas, but the war she'd fight every day just to prove she belonged. Boot camp at Parris Island in South Carolina was everything she'd been warned about and worse. The humidity hit her like a physical wall when she stepped off the bus, thick, oppressive, nothing like Montana's clean mountain air. The drill instructors screamed until veins bulged in their necks. The physical training was brutal, designed to break the weak and forge the strong. But Sarah had expected all of that. What she hadn't fully prepared for was the isolation. The other female recruits bonded over their shared misery, forming tight groups for survival and support. They complained together, cried together, helped each other through the worst moments. But Sarah didn't fit with them either. She was too competitive, too intense, too unwilling to accept good enough for a girl as an acceptable standard. When the others struggled with a task, Sarah mastered it. When they celebrated passing a test, Sarah was already studying for the next one. It made her respected but not liked, admired but not befriended. The drill instructors noticed her immediately, and not always in good ways. During the first rifle qualification, she shot perfect scores, 250 out of 250, expert marksman, every round exactly where it needed to be. Drill instructor Staff Sergeant Marcus Kane watched through binoculars, his face hardening with each perfect hit. When she came off the range, he pulled her aside, his voice low and dangerous. "Mitchell, you cheated." Sarah's heart hammered, but she kept her voice steady. "No, sir. Nobody shoots perfect on their first qual. Nobody, especially not some little girl from Montana. You had help, or you already knew the targets or something, so you're going to qual again tomorrow." She did another perfect score. Kane's face turned purple. Again, Friday. 3 times she qualified, 3 times she shot perfect scores. Finally, on the 3rd time, Kane pulled her aside after watching her put every single round through the center of the target. His voice was quiet now, almost contemplative. "Mitchell, you shoot like you were born with a rifle in your hands. That's not a compliment, it's a warning. You're going to make a lot of men uncomfortable. You're going to threaten egos. You're going to face resistance every single day of your career." He paused, and for just a moment, something almost like respect flickered in his eyes. "You're also going to have to work twice as hard to get half the credit. Get used to disappointment. Get used to being underestimated, and get used to proving yourself over and over and over again, because they will never just accept that you belong. You're going to have to earn it every single day." Sarah looked him in the eye and said the words that would become her mantra for the next 15 years. "Yes, sir. I understand, sir." But understanding and experiencing were two different things. As she moved through her training, excelling in every metric, she began to notice the pattern. When she succeeded, it was luck or favoritism. When she failed, even small failures every recruit experienced, it was proof that women didn't belong. Every achievement came with an asterisk, every promotion with whispered accusations of diversity quotas. She learned to keep her head down, to let her performance speak, to never complain because complaints would only confirm what they already believed, that she was weak, emotional, unsuited for the warrior culture of the Marines. But late at night in her rack while the other recruits slept, Sarah would remember her father's words, "You have a gift, baby girl." And she'd remember that tin can jumping off the fence post in Montana, the smell of pine and frost, the feeling of absolute certainty when her finger touched the trigger. They could doubt her all they wanted. She knew what she was capable of. She just had to wait for the moment to prove it. That moment, she was beginning to realize, might be waiting for her in the Arizona desert, 2,000 yards away from a target most people said was impossible to hit. Her father had taught her to shoot in those Montana mountains. The Marines had forged her into something harder, sharper, more dangerous. Now it was time to show the world what Montana blood and Marine Corps steel could accomplish together. After completing boot camp and infantry training, Sarah Mitchell was assigned to Camp Pendleton in California, where the Pacific Ocean crashed against the base perimeter, and the sun baked everything golden brown. She arrived with her expert marksman qualification, her perfect scores, and her unshakable determination. What she didn't have was a single person in her new unit who wanted her there. The men of Bravo Company, 1st Battalion, 5th Marines made that clear from day one. Her platoon commander, 1st Lieutenant Marcus Webb, was a squared-away officer with 2 combat deployments and 0 patience for what he called social experiments. During their first meeting, he looked at Sarah's personnel file with the enthusiasm of a man examining a parking ticket. "Mitchell, I see you shot expert at Paris Island. Good for you. Here's the reality. This is an infantry unit. We don't have time to babysit. You keep up or you get out. Clear." "Crystal clear, sir," Sarah replied, her face a mask of professional neutrality even as anger simmered beneath her skin. She wasn't asking for special treatment. She just wanted a fair shot. But fair, she was learning, was a relative concept when you were the only woman in a company of 180 men. The first platoon qualification came 2 weeks later. Sarah posted the highest score in the company, 244 out of 250, missing expert by 6 points only because of one bad wind call at 500 yards. She should have been proud. Instead, she overheard the conversation in the armory afterward. Lieutenant Webb went easy on her, probably gave her the answers. "My girlfriend could shoot expert if they lowered the standards enough." The words stung worse than any physical pain because there was nothing she could do to fight them. Her performance spoke for itself, but they refused to listen. That's when she learned about the Scout Sniper course, the Marines' elite school for precision marksmen, the forge where legends were made. Carlos Hathcock, the White Feather, had been a Scout sniper. So had Chuck Mahoney with 103 confirmed kills in Vietnam. The course was brutally difficult. 11 weeks of hell where students learned stalking, camouflage, range estimation, advanced ballistics, and shooting at distances most Marines never attempted. The failure rate hovered around 40%. But graduates emerged as the tip of the spear. The quiet professionals who could change the outcome of entire battles with a single well-placed shot. Sarah knew with absolute certainty that this was her path. She submitted her application with impeccable paperwork, recommendations from her drill instructors, and qualification scores that exceeded every minimum standard. She waited 3 weeks for the response. When it came, it was a single page, bureaucratic and cold. Application denied. Recommend reapplication during next cycle. No explanation, no feedback, no path forward. She applied again 6 months later. Denied. Then again, denied. For 3 years she submitted the same application with the same perfect scores and the same recommendations, and for 3 years she received the same form letter rejection. Finally, after the 5th denial, she confronted Lieutenant Webb directly. "Sir, I need to know why I keep getting rejected. My scores qualify me. What's the issue?" Webb had the decency to look uncomfortable. He shuffled papers on his desk, not meeting her eyes. "Mitchell, look. The course isn't designed for women, it's physically demanding. You'd be in the field for days with no facilities, sharing close quarters with men. You'd be a distraction. The instructors don't want to deal with it. Just find another specialty. Intel, maybe. Admin." "With respect, sir, that's not good enough," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fury building in her chest. "The course requirements don't say men only. If I meet the standards, I should be allowed to attend." "Sometimes the real world doesn't match the paperwork, Mitchell," Webb said, his tone final. "Drop it." But Sarah Mitchell had never been good at dropping things. If the official channels were closed, she'd find another way. She started training on her own time, waking at 400 to run 5 miles before morning PT, spending weekends at civilian ranges pushing her skills to the limit. She studied ballistics textbooks like they were holy scripture, memorizing equations for wind drift and bullet drop. She learned to calculate the Coriolis effect in her head, to estimate range using mil dots, to read terrain features for stalking approaches. There were a few allies along the way, people who saw past her gender to her potential. Gunnery Sergeant Thomas Rodriguez, a scout sniper instructor with 3 combat tours, started showing up at the same civilian ranges Sarah frequented. He never acknowledged that he was there to help her, but somehow he was always available when she had questions. "Your breathing's off," he'd comment casually. "You're muscling the trigger. Let me show you something." Under Rodriguez's unofficial mentorship, Sarah's skills sharpened from excellent to exceptional. She started entering civilian long-range competitions, events where engineers, ranchers, former military, and shooting enthusiasts gathered to test themselves against distance and wind. In those competitions, gender mattered less than group size. She won her first match at 1,000 yards, beating 47 other shooters. Then she won another, and another. Her trophy collection grew, along with her reputation in the civilian precision shooting community. But the Marine Corps remained unmoved. Application 6, denied. Application 7, denied. Sarah was beginning to think she'd spend her entire career fighting this particular battle when fate intervened in the form of a training exercise gone right. It was August 2015, in the Mojave Desert at 29 Palms, where the heat could kill you and the landscape looked like Mars. Sarah's battalion was running a large-scale combined arms exercise. Infantry, armor, artillery, all working together in a simulated combat scenario. The exercise had been running for 3 days when the situation developed. A simulated enemy force had taken position in a rocky ridgeline 1,100 yards from Sarah's unit's position. The enemy had high ground, good cover, and simulated heavy weapons that were cutting her unit to pieces. The designated marksman, Corporal Hayes, was supposed to provide precision fire support, but Hayes's rifle had malfunctioned, a broken firing pin that rendered it useless. The exercise was stalling, the evaluators were getting impatient, and the unit was taking simulated casualties at an alarming rate. That's when Colonel Patricia Hernandez, the exercise commander and the highest-ranking woman in the division, made a decision that would change everything. "Mitchell," Hernandez's voice cracked over the radio. "You're a marksman, right? Grab Hayes's backup rifle and get up here." Sarah's heart hammered as she sprinted to the position, grabbed the M110 semi-automatic sniper rifle, and dropped into position beside the colonel. Through her scope, she could see the enemy positions, small figures at impossible distance, shimmering in the heat mirage. The wind was gusting unpredictably, kicking up dust devils that danced across the desert floor. "No pressure, Captain," Hernandez said with a slight smile, but about 50 people are watching to see if this works. Sarah settled into the rifle, feeling its unfamiliar weight and balance. She'd trained with the M110 before, but never in combat conditions, never with an audience, never with this much riding on her performance. She found her breath control, slowed her heart rate, and calculated the shot. 1,100 yards in desert heat, with variable wind and mirage distorting everything. She made her adjustments and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked. A second later, the spotter called it. Hit, target down. Sarah didn't celebrate. She was already acquiring the next target, squeeze. Hit, next target, squeeze. Hit. She worked through the enemy position methodically, each shot precisely calculated, each hit confirmed. 10 shots, 10 hits. The enemy position collapsed and the exercise continued. When she came off the line, Colonel Hernandez was waiting with an expression Sarah had rarely seen directed at her, genuine respect. "Mitchell, that was some of the finest shooting I've ever witnessed. Where did you learn to shoot like that?" Sarah almost said Montana, but caught herself. "Self-taught, ma'am, and some help from Gunny Rodriguez." Hernandez nodded slowly, a plan forming behind her eyes. "Well, it's time to make it official. I'm personally recommending you for Scout Sniper School, and this time I'm making sure the recommendation reaches the commandant's office. Let's see them deny you when a colonel's name is on the paperwork." 6 weeks later, Sarah received new orders. Report to Scout Sniper School, Quantico, Virginia. She'd been trying for 3 years. She'd been denied 7 times, but she was finally getting her shot. As she packed her gear, she thought about Lieutenant Webb's words. The course isn't designed for women. Good, she thought. Time to redesign it. Scout Sniper School at Quantico, Virginia, began on a Monday morning in October when the air was crisp and the leaves were turning gold and red. Sarah Mitchell stood in formation with 23 other candidates, all men, all watching her with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed hostility. The lead instructor, Chief Warrant Officer Daniel Pierce, was a legend. 2 decades in the Corps, multiple combat deployments, a confirmed kill count he never discussed publicly. He walked the line of students like a general inspecting troops, his eyes missing nothing. When he reached Sarah, he stopped. The silence stretched out, heavy and deliberate. "Captain Mitchell," he said, his voice neutral but his eyes hard as diamonds. "You're the first female student we've ever had in this course. That makes you historic. It also makes you a distraction, a political statement, and a potential liability." He paused, letting the words sink in. "I don't care about making history. I care about graduating snipers who can operate in the worst conditions imaginable and still make the shot that saves their brothers' lives. Can you do that?" Sarah met his gaze without flinching. "Yes, sir, that's why I'm here." Pierce studied her for another long moment, then moved on. But Sarah could feel the weight of every eye in that formation. She wasn't just representing herself, she was representing every woman who'd ever wanted to do this job. Fail, and she'd confirm every stereotype. Succeed, and she'd still face accusations of lowered standards. There was no winning, only survival. The first week was designed to break students physically and mentally. They carried 80-pound packs on 20-mile marches through the Virginia wilderness. They crawled through mud and under barbed wire. They went days without sleep, functioning on caffeine and willpower. Sarah's body screamed in protest. She was strong, but she weighed 60 pounds less than the average male student, which meant the same pack represented a larger percentage of her body weight. Every step was agony, every mile a battle. But she refused to quit. When her shoulders bled from the pack straps, she bandaged them and kept moving. When her feet developed blisters that burst and bled into her boots, she changed her socks and drove on. The male students watched, waiting for her to fall out, to call for a medic, to raise her hand and say, "I quit." She never did, and slowly, grudgingly, a few of them started to respect her for it. The academic portion was equally brutal. They studied ballistics, meteorology, range estimation, target detection. They learned to calculate bullet drop, wind drift, the Magnus effect, gyroscopic drift. They memorized data books full of numbers that could mean the difference between a hit and a miss at extreme range. Sarah excelled here. Her 3 years of self-study meant she knew most of this material already. She finished first in the class on the ballistics exam, a perfect score that raised eyebrows and generated whispers. Someone gave her the answers. One student muttered loud enough for her to hear. But it was on the range where Sarah truly came alive. The stalking exercises were her favorite. The challenge of moving hundreds of yards across open terrain without being detected, getting into position, taking a shot, and exfiltrating without the instructors spotting her. She was small, which was an advantage here. She could fold herself into terrain features that larger men couldn't use. Her patience, honed over years of hunting with her father in Montana, allowed her to move at a glacial pace when necessary, 1 inch per minute, freezing for hours if that's what the stalk required. On her third stalk, she achieved what the instructors called a perfect approach. She moved 600 yards across rolling hills with multiple observer positions, took her shot from 400 yards, and exfiltrated without being spotted even once. Chief Warrant Officer Pierce reviewed the observation logs afterward, shaking his head in disbelief. "Mitchell, I've been teaching this course for 12 years. That's the third perfect stalk I've ever seen." He paused. "Don't let it go to your head. You've still got 8 weeks to screw up." But the toll of being the only woman was wearing on her in ways the physical training never could. She couldn't bond with the other students the way they bonded with each other. They went to the barracks at night and swapped stories, built camaraderie, became brothers. Sarah went to her separate quarters alone. When they grabbed beers at the enlisted club on rare free evenings, she wasn't invited. When they talked about their lives, their families, their fears, they fell silent if she approached. She was respected for her skills, but isolated by her gender, an outsider looking in at the brotherhood she could never truly join. The breaking point came during week 7, during the unknown distance range qualification. Students were given 10 targets at unknown distances between 300 and 800 yards, with 10 minutes to range them, calculate solutions, and engage. It was one of the most important tests of the course. Sarah was paired with another student, Sergeant Kyle Morrison, as her spotter. Morrison was tall, competent, and had made his opinion of women in the sniper course very clear. They didn't belong. As Sarah ranged the first target and prepared to shoot, Morrison gave her wind calls that were deliberately wrong. "Wind's 5 miles per hour from the left," he said. Sarah checked her own indicators. The wind was clearly gusting from the right at nearly 10 miles per hour. She corrected and made the shot, hit. Second target, Morrison gave her another bad call. She corrected again, hit. By the fourth target, it was obvious what was happening. He was sabotaging her, trying to make her fail. Sarah's anger burned white-hot, but she forced it down. Getting emotional would only confirm what they believed about women. Instead, she ignored every call Morrison gave her, made her own calculations, and shot the entire course using her own data. She finished with 9 hits out of 10, the highest score of the day. As she cleared her rifle, she looked at Morrison and said quietly, "Thanks for the spots, Sergeant. Very informative." Morrison's face went red. He knew she knew, and he knew she'd beaten him anyway. After the evolution, Chief Warrant Officer Pierce pulled her aside. "Mitchell, I watched that entire range session. I saw what Morrison was doing. You could have reported him, gotten him kicked out of the course for integrity violations." "Yes, sir, I could have," Sarah said. "Why didn't you?" Sarah chose her words carefully. "Because reporting him would make me look weak, like I needed protection. Making the shots anyway sends a better message. I don't need anyone's help. I don't need special treatment. I just need a rifle and a target." She paused. "Besides, sir, if I'm going to earn their respect, it has to be on the range, not in an administrative hearing." Pierce studied her with those hard eyes, then nodded slowly. "You're learning. Good, because week 9 is going to make this look easy." Week 9 was the final field exercise, a simulated combat scenario where students operated in 2-man teams for 5 days with minimal food, no sleep, and constant pressure from instructors playing enemy forces. Sarah was paired with Corporal James Chen, one of the few students who treated her with basic professional courtesy throughout the course. They were inserted into the Virginia mountains with a radio, their rifles, and a mission: locate and eliminate 3 high-value targets while evading capture. It rained the entire 5 days, a cold October rain that soaked through everything and turned the mountains into a muddy nightmare. Sarah and Chen moved like ghosts through the forest, sleeping in 2-hour shifts, eating cold MREs, communicating in whispers and hand signals. They found their first target on day 2, an instructor positioned 700 yards away in a mock compound. Sarah took the shot in pouring rain, compensating for the water droplets' effect on the bullet's trajectory. Hit. The second target was harder, 900 yards across a valley, with instructors actively hunting for their position. They stalked for 8 hours, moving 50 yards at a time, freezing whenever the enemy came close. Sarah's uniform was caked in mud, her face painted green and brown, leaves and branches woven into her gear until she looked like part of the forest itself. When she finally had the shot, her hands were shaking from cold and exhaustion. She forced them steady, controlled her breathing, and pressed the trigger. Hit. The final target was the most difficult, a moving vehicle scenario at unknown distance, requiring them to set up an ambush, range the target as it moved, and take the shot through a narrow window of opportunity. They had one chance. Miss, and they'd fail the exercise. Sarah set up on a ridgeline overlooking a dirt road while Chen spotted. They waited for 6 hours, hungry, cold, exhausted. When the vehicle finally appeared, Chen called out the range: 850 yards, moving left to right, 12 miles per hour. Sarah's mind calculated automatically: lead, windage, elevation. The vehicle was moving through her scope's field of view. She had maybe 3 seconds. Her finger found the trigger, steady pressure. The rifle spoke. Through her scope, she saw the driver slump forward. The simulated round had found its mark. Mission complete. When they returned to base 3 days later, filthy and exhausted, Chief Warrant Officer Pierce was waiting. Mitchell Chen, that was textbook fieldcraft. Well done. He looked at Sarah specifically. Captain, your final shot was at 847 yards on a moving target in crosswind conditions after 5 days without sleep. That's not just good, that's exceptional. The final week brought written exams, equipment inspections, and the formal qualification shoot. 10 targets from 300 to 1,000 yards in various positions and conditions. Sarah posted the second highest score in the class, missing first place by 2 points. The graduate who beat her was Sergeant First Class Mike Harrison, an Army exchange student with Olympic shooting experience. When the final rankings were posted, Sarah saw her name, second out of 24 graduates. Second, not first. It burned, that one word. She'd wanted to be first, to leave no doubt, to silence every critic with absolute dominance. But second was still historic. Second was still proof that she belonged. And when Chief Warrant Officer Pierce called her name at graduation and handed her the Scout Sniper badge, the crossed rifles over a scope that marked her as one of the elite, she felt something shift inside her. She'd done it. Against every obstacle, every doubter, every person who said women couldn't handle this course, she'd graduated. She was a Marine Scout Sniper now, officially, permanently. No one could take that away. As she stood at attention wearing that badge, she thought about all the times she'd been told no, all the rejections, all the sneers and doubts, and she smiled, because they'd all been wrong. But even as she celebrated, Sarah knew the truth. This wasn't the end of her proving herself. It was just the beginning. Being the first woman Scout Sniper meant every mission would be watched, every shot judged, every mistake magnified. She'd have to be perfect, or as close to perfect as humanly possible. The real test was just beginning. Sarah's success at Scout Sniper School should have opened doors. Instead, it seemed to weld them shut. Her first assignment as a qualified sniper was to a reconnaissance platoon at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, where she arrived with her new badge gleaming on her uniform and her reputation preceding her like a warning flare. The platoon sergeant, a grizzled veteran named First Sergeant Jake Dawson, looked at her orders with the enthusiasm of a man being handed a live grenade. "So you're the famous Captain Mitchell," he said, not bothering to hide the skepticism in his voice. "The one who made all the headlines." And there it was, the real problem. Sarah hadn't just graduated Scout Sniper School, she'd become a media sensation. News outlets had run stories. First female Marine Scout Sniper makes history. The Marine Corps Public Affairs Office had paraded her around for photo ops. She'd been interviewed, featured, celebrated. And her fellow Marines resented every second of it. "I didn't ask for the attention, First Sergeant," Sarah said evenly. "I just wanted to do the job." "Well, here's the job," Dawson replied, sliding a folder across his desk. "You're a sniper. That means you work with a spotter, you take the shots others can't, and you keep your mouth shut about it afterward. No press, no glory, just the work. Can you handle that?" "Yes, First Sergeant." But handling it proved more complicated than she'd anticipated. Half the platoon refused to work with her, citing team cohesion and trust issues. The ones who would work with her did so with obvious reluctance, treating her like a liability rather than an asset. During training exercises, she'd make perfect shots and hear whispers. Instructors went easy on her at sniper school. Standards were lowered. She's only here because of politics. Then came Afghanistan. Helmand Province, 2016, where the desert stretched endless and hostile, where the Taliban controlled vast swaths of territory, where every patrol could turn deadly in an instant. Sarah deployed with her platoon to Forward Operating Base Dalaram, a collection of concrete barriers and desperate hope in the middle of nowhere. Her spotter was Corporal James Chen, the same Marine who'd been her partner during the final field exercise at sniper school. Chen was professional, competent, and most importantly, judged her only on her performance. The mission that changed everything came on a scorching July afternoon when the temperature hit 118 degrees and the air felt thick enough to drink. Sarah's unit was conducting a patrol through a village suspected of harboring Taliban fighters when everything went sideways. The Taliban had set up an ambush, a coordinated attack from multiple positions, with the main fighting force dug into a compound on high ground 1,400 yards from the Marines' position. The enemy had planned it perfectly. They had elevation, cover, and heavy machine guns that poured fire down on the exposed Marines. Sarah's unit was pinned, taking casualties, unable to advance or retreat. The radio crackled with desperate calls for air support, but the nearest gunships were 20 minutes out. Men were bleeding in the dirt, medics were screaming for cover, and the Taliban machine guns just kept hammering. "Mitchell, Chen, get up here," the platoon commander's voice cut through the chaos. Sarah and Chen sprinted to a position behind a low mud wall, bullets cracking through the air around them. Through her scope, Sarah could see the enemy compound, a two-story structure with fighters moving between positions, coordinating their fire. The distance was extreme. The wind was gusting unpredictably, and dust from the firefight was obscuring everything. "No shot," the platoon commander said over the radio, his voice strained. "Distance is too far, conditions are too bad, we wait for air support." But Sarah was already ranging targets, her mind calculating trajectories while bullets snapped overhead. She could see the enemy commander, a tall figure in black, moving between positions, directing the fight. Take him out and the attack might collapse. Chen saw what she was thinking. "Sarah, that's 1,400 yards in variable wind with dust everywhere. That's possible," Sarah finished. She settled into position, feeling the familiar calm descend over her like a blanket. The chaos faded. The fear disappeared. There was only the rifle, the target, and the math. Wind speed fluctuating between 8 and 15 miles per hour, temperature 118 degrees, altitude 3,200 feet, target moving slowly left to right. Her father's voice echoed from Montana. "Find that quiet place between heartbeats, baby girl." She found it, squeezed the trigger. The rifle roared and bucked. For what felt like an eternity but was actually less than 2 seconds, the bullet flew through heat and dust and chaos. Then the enemy commander dropped. The Taliban fighters visible through her scope stopped moving, confused, looking around for the threat they couldn't see. Sarah didn't pause to celebrate. She was already acquiring her next target, the machine gun nest on the left side of the compound. Chen called the wind. Sarah calculated, adjusted, fired. The machine gunner slumped over his weapon. Next target, right side machine gun. Fire. Hit. The enemy position was falling apart, fighters abandoning their posts, running for cover. In less than 3 minutes, Sarah had fired 7 shots and eliminated 5 critical targets at 1,400 yards in combat conditions that made most shooters refuse to even attempt the shot. The Taliban attack collapsed. The Marines advanced and secured the compound. Sarah's unit took no further casualties. When they returned to base that evening, covered in dust and sweat and the residue of violence, the platoon commander pulled her aside. Major David Torres had been skeptical of her from day one, another officer who thought women in combat was a political experiment. Now he looked at her with something approaching awe. "Captain Mitchell, I owe you an apology," he said quietly. I didn't believe you could do this job at the highest level, but what you did out there today saved lives. Probably saved a dozen Marines from being killed or wounded. That wasn't luck. That was skill at a level I've rarely seen." Sarah wanted to say, "I told you so." She wanted to scream that she'd been telling them all along, that she'd been proving herself over and over and they just refused to see it. But she didn't. She just nodded and said, "Thank you, sir. Just doing my job." The Navy Commendation Medal came through 2 months later for heroism in combat. It should have been a Bronze Star. Everyone knew it. But commendations for women in combat roles were still being quietly downgraded by some commands. Sarah didn't care about the medal. What mattered was that she'd proven, in the most extreme circumstances possible, that she belonged, that she could take the shot when it mattered most. That gender was irrelevant when bullets were flying and Marines were dying. But even after Afghanistan, even after confirmed kills in combat, the whispers continued. Back at Legeth Base, she heard them in the chow hall, in the gym, in the corridors. Lucky shots, flat range conditions, wind must have been calm. The goalpost kept moving, the standards kept shifting, the bar kept rising. No matter what she accomplished, it was never quite enough to silence the doubters. That's when Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She stopped trying to convince her critics. Instead, she focused on pushing the boundaries of what was possible. She started experimenting with extreme long-range shooting, studying ballistics at distances most military snipers never attempted. She read about legendary shots, Craig Harrison's 2,475-meter shot in Afghanistan, the Canadian sniper who hit a target at 3,540 meters. These were the outer limits of the possible, where physics and skill intersected with luck and conditions. She began training for shots beyond 2,000 yards, setting up at civilian ranges during leave, paying out of pocket for ammunition and range time. Other shooters thought she was obsessed, maybe even crazy. "Why are you training for shots you'll never take in combat?" they asked. Sarah's answer was simple, "Because I need to know what I'm capable of. I need to know where my limits are." The truth was deeper. She needed a shot so spectacular, so undeniable, that it would silence every critic forever. After her deployment, Sarah was promoted to captain and assigned to the Marine Corps Marksmanship Training Unit at Quantico, Virginia. It was an instructor position, prestigious but also potentially career-ending for someone who wanted to stay operational. She taught marksmanship fundamentals to new Marines, ran advanced courses for designated marksmen, and quietly continued her long-range experiments. That's where she was, on a cold February morning in 2019, when she saw the email that would change everything. The subject line read, "International Military Marksmanship Competition Nominations Open." Sarah's heart started racing as she read the details. The competition was held every 4 years, bringing together elite shooters from allied nations. This year, the 50th anniversary, would be held at Yuma Proving Ground in Arizona. And this year, to commemorate the occasion, The organizers were including unprecedented challenges, including Sarah's breath caught, a 2,000-yard shot from a standing position. She read that line 3 times to make sure she wasn't hallucinating. 2,000 yards, standing. It was insane, impossible, exactly the kind of challenge that separated legends from everyone else. This was her chance. This was the moment she'd been training for without even knowing it. She immediately drafted a letter requesting to join the Marine Corps shooting team for the competition. The response from her commanding officer, Colonel Richard Stone, came 2 days later. He called her into his office and she could tell from his expression that the news wasn't good. "Mitchell, I got your request to compete at the international competition. Look, you're an excellent instructor, but competition shooting is different. The pressure, the politics, the media attention, it's a lot. Maybe you should wait until the next one in 4 years." Sarah felt her jaw tighten. 4 years. By then she'd be 37, possibly past her physical prime, possibly no longer in a position to compete. "Sir, with respect, I've earned this opportunity. My scores qualify me for the team. I've got combat experience and scout sniper qualification. I'm ready." Colonel Stone sighed, the sound of a man who saw a headache approaching. "Mitchell, here's the situation. If you compete and fail, it reflects badly on the Corps. The media will have a field day. Female Marine can't compete with men. You know how the headlines will read. I'm trying to protect you from that." "I don't need protection, sir. I need a chance." Stone studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Fine, but you're going as an alternate. If one of the primary shooters can't compete, you're in. That's the best I can do." It was an insult wrapped in a concession, but Sarah took it. She'd learned long ago that you don't always get what you deserve. You get what you can negotiate. "Thank you, sir." For the next 6 months, Sarah trained like her life depended on it. She practiced the 2,000-yard standing shot obsessively, calculating every variable, filming herself to analyze stance and trigger control. She burned through her savings buying ammunition, spent every free moment at the range. Other instructors thought she was wasting her time. "Mitchell, nobody's making that shot standing up," they told her. "It's impossible." Sarah just smiled. She'd heard that word before. And 3 weeks before the competition, when one of the primary team members tore his rotator cuff during training, she got the call. She was going to Yuma. She was getting her shot. And she was going to make damn sure the whole world watched. The Yuma Proving Ground stretched across 1,300 square miles of Arizona desert, a landscape so hostile it looked like God had given up halfway through creation. Sarah Mitchell arrived 3 days before the competition began, stepping off the transport bus into heat that hit her like a physical blow. 108 degrees at 9 a.m., with the sun, a merciless white disk in a sky bleached of color. This was where they tested artillery, where they pushed weapons and equipment to their breaking points. Now it would test her. The International Military Marksmanship Competition had transformed a section of the proving ground into a shooter's paradise and nightmare combined. Ranges stretched out to impossible distances, target systems rose from the desert floor like monuments, and observation towers allowed spectators and judges to watch every shot. 15 nations had sent their best: Britain, Germany, Canada, Australia, France, Norway, and more. Over 60 elite shooters, each one a champion in their own right, each one carrying their nation's pride on their shoulders. Sarah checked into the competitor housing, a series of climate-controlled buildings that felt like paradise after the desert heat, and immediately noticed the stairs. She was the only woman in the entire competition, not the only female Marine or the only American woman, the only woman, period. Every eye tracked her movements, every conversation seemed to pause as she walked past. Some looks were curious, some skeptical, some openly hostile. She'd learned to ignore them all. The opening ceremony was held that evening under massive tents with industrial fans fighting a losing battle against the heat. The competition director, a retired British Army colonel named Sir Malcolm Price, gave a speech about tradition, excellence, and the bonds between allied nations. Sarah barely listened. She was studying the competition, identifying threats, assessing weaknesses. The British team had Sergeant Aaron Walsh, an Olympic medalist with perfect scores in international competition. The German team featured Klaus Richter, a sniper with confirmed kills in Afghanistan who could reportedly hit targets at 1,800 meters. The Canadian team brought Sarah Chen, no relation to James, who'd won the last 3 national championships. And then there was the American Army team, led by Staff Sergeant Derek Haynes. He sat 3 tables away, surrounded by his team, laughing loudly at someone's joke. When his eyes found Sarah, his grin widened. He raised his beer in a mock salute. She didn't respond, just turned away. Let him have his moment. The range would do the talking. Day 1 began at dawn with the 1,000-yard prone event. Shooters had 10 shots to group as tightly as possible on paper targets. Conditions were ideal: minimal wind, clear visibility, the cool morning air providing excellent ballistics. Sarah shot well, posting a group size of 4.2 inches. Respectable, solid, but not spectacular. Haynes shot 3.8 inches. Walsh shot 3.6. She finished 8th out of 60 competitors. The media barely noticed her. Day 2 brought the moving target challenge, simulated vehicle and personnel targets traveling at various speeds from 400 to 800 yards. This was Sarah's specialty, the kind of dynamic shooting she'd mastered in Afghanistan. She hit 7 out of 8 targets, missing only the fastest, a simulated motorcycle at 600 yards doing 40 miles per hour. It was good enough for 4th place. Haynes finished 3rd. Walsh took 1st. Suddenly Sarah was on the leaderboard, and the media started paying attention. That night reporters swarmed her at the mess hall. "Captain Mitchell, how does it feel to be the only woman competing? Do you think you can win? What's your response to critics who say you only made the team because of diversity requirements?" Sarah kept her answers professional, neutral, boring. "I'm here to represent the Marine Corps and shoot to the best of my ability. That's all." But she could feel the pressure building like a thunderstorm on the horizon. Day 3 was supposed to be the wind shooting event, but desert winds hit 40 miles per hour by noon, creating dust storms that reduced visibility to near zero. The event was postponed, which meant Day 4 would include 2 competitions: wind shooting in the morning, obscured target engagement in the afternoon. Sarah welcomed the challenge. More events meant more opportunities to climb the rankings. The wind shooting event pushed everyone to their limits. Targets at 800 and 1,000 yards in gusting crosswinds that shifted direction every few minutes. You had to read the wind flags, watch the mirage, calculate constantly changing solutions. Sarah thrived in chaos. Montana had taught her that wind was just another variable to master. She shot carefully, methodically, taking her time between shots. When the scores posted, she'd taken 2nd place, beaten only by Klaus Richter. Haynes finished 5th, and she could see the frustration on his face. The obscured target event that afternoon played to Sarah's stalking skills from Scout Sniper School. Targets were hidden behind vegetation, camouflage, and terrain features. Shooters had to detect them first, then engage them at unknown distances. Sarah's patience and observation skills gave her an edge. She spotted targets others missed, ranged them accurately, and shot clean. When the final scores posted, she'd won the event outright. 1st place. The crowd's reaction was mixed, applause from some, stunned silence from others. Now she was 4th overall on the leaderboard, climbing steadily. Haynes was 3rd, Walsh 2nd, and Sarah Chen from Canada held 1st place by a narrow margin. The media circus intensified. CNN ran a feature, "Female Marine Surges Up Leaderboard at International Competition." Military Times published an article analyzing her performance. Social media exploded with arguments about women in combat standards and whether she deserved to be there. Sarah deleted every app from her phone and focused on preparation. Master Sergeant Lisa Torres, her Army spotter for the competition, found her that evening on the practice range. Torres was a 15-year veteran, a no-nonsense professional who'd seen combat in Iraq. She'd been skeptical of Sarah at first, but 3 days of watching her shoot had changed her mind. "You know they're all talking about you," Torres said. settling into position beside Sarah. "I know," Sarah replied, adjusting her scope. "Haynes is telling anyone who'll listen that you've peaked too early, that the pressure's going to crush you tomorrow when it really matters." Sarah smiled thinly. "Derek's been underestimating me since day one. I'm used to it." "Tomorrow's the 2,000-yard standing shot," Tors continued. "That's what everyone's really here for. All the other events are just warm-up. You make that shot, you're a legend. You miss it." She trailed off, the implications clear. "I won't miss," Sarah said with quiet certainty. Tors studied her for a moment. "You've been practicing this shot, haven't you? That's why you've been out here every night after competition ends." Sarah nodded. For 6 months, she'd trained for this single moment. She'd calculated every variable, the ballistics of her .338 Lapua Magnum at extreme range, the effects of Yuma's altitude and temperature, the wind patterns that developed in the desert afternoon. She'd practiced her standing position until she could hold the rifle steady for minutes at a time, trained her breathing until she could drop her heart rate to 40 beats per minute on command. This shot wasn't impossible, it was just improbable. And Sarah Mitchell had built her entire career on accomplishing the improbable. Day 5 dawned clear and hot, with winds forecast to build throughout the day. The morning events, precision shots at 600 and 800 yards from various positions, went quickly. Sarah shot well enough to maintain her 4th-place position, but her mind was already on the afternoon. On the shot that would define her career, her legacy, perhaps her entire life. By 1 p.m., the temperature had climbed to 104 degrees. By 2 p.m., when they announced the 2,000-yard standing shot would begin, winds were gusting between 8 and 15 miles per hour. The worst possible conditions. Perfect, Sarah thought. Anything less would make the accomplishment seem easier. The crowd gathered, hundreds of spectators, media crews, military brass from a dozen nations. The shooting order was announced. Lowest overall ranking shoots first, highest ranking shoots last. Sarah would shoot 6th. The British shooter Walsh would shoot last, and Haynes, currently in 3rd place, would shoot 5th, right before her. The first shooter, an Australian corporal, stepped to the line. Through binoculars, the target looked impossibly small, a 36-inch circle nearly a mile and a quarter away. The Australian settled into his stance, fired. The spotters watched through high-powered scopes. "Miss no impact," the crowd murmured. This was going to be harder than anyone thought. The second shooter from France came closer but still missed. The 3rd shooter, a Norwegian sniper with an impressive resume, grazed the edge of the target. The crowd erupted, first hit of the day, but it was barely a hit, catching just the outer ring. The Canadian Sarah Chen stepped up next. She was a solid shooter, methodical and careful. She fired. Hit, 12 inches from center. The crowd went wild. That was the new standard to beat. Then came the British sergeant, Aaron Walsh. He was the favorite, the one everyone expected to dominate. He settled into an unusual stance, feet wide, knees bent deep, almost a half squat that looked uncomfortable but apparently worked for him. The crowd held its breath. He fired. Hit, 8 inches from center. The British contingent celebrated like they'd won the whole competition. It was an incredible shot, perhaps the best standing shot at that distance ever recorded in competition. Then it was Haynes's turn. He stepped to the line with his characteristic swagger, working the crowd, letting the tension build. He checked his rifle with theatrical precision, making a show of his preparation. Sarah watched from the ready area, her face expressionless, but her mind was cataloging everything. The way the wind flags were moving, the heat mirage patterns, the way dust was being kicked up. Haynes finally settled into his stance, a modified isosceles with his weight forward, aggressive and powerful. The range went silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. Haynes fired, the crack of his rifle echoing across the desert. For 3 seconds everyone waited. Then the spotters' voices came through the speakers. Hit, 8 inches from center, same as Walsh. The army contingent erupted in celebration. Haynes had matched the British shooter's incredible performance. He'd proven he belonged among the world's elite. As Haynes walked back from the firing line, he passed Sarah, who was preparing her equipment. The cameras were on them, capturing the moment. He paused, his smile wide and confident. "Good luck, sweetheart," he said, loud enough for the microphones to catch. "That's going to be hard to beat." The words were friendly on the surface, but the condescension underneath was unmistakable. He was already savoring his victory, already imagining the headlines. Army sniper dominates international competition. Sarah didn't acknowledge him. She didn't look up, didn't respond, didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. She just continued checking her rifle, the wrong gun that he'd mocked 4 days ago, the massive .338 Lapua Magnum that most people thought was too much for her to handle. Her hands moved with practiced precision, checking the bolt, the scope, the magazine. Everything was perfect. Everything was ready. She stood and walked to the firing line, her rifle held loosely in her hands, her face calm. But inside, her heart was pounding with anticipation. This was it. 15 years of training, 15 years of doubt and criticism, 15 years of proving herself over and over. All of it came down to this: one rifle, one target, one shot. She stepped up to the line and looked downrange at the tiny speck that was her target, 2,000 yards away. The crowd noise faded. The pressure disappeared. There was only the shot, waiting to be taken. Sarah Mitchell stood at the firing line, and the world contracted to a single point of focus. The crowd noise faded to a distant hum. The heat became irrelevant. The pressure evaporated like morning dew in the desert sun. She'd been here before, not physically, but mentally. Every difficult shot in her career had required this same transformation, this shift from human to instrument, from soldier to pure focused intention. She settled into her stance, feet shoulder-width apart, her left foot slightly forward for stability. Her knees bent just enough to absorb the micro-movements of her own pulse, to create a living shock absorber between earth and rifle. The .338 Lapua Magnum came up smoothly, 12 pounds of precision engineering that felt as natural in her hands as her own heartbeat. Through her scope, she could barely see the target, a tiny circular speck shimmering in the heat mirage, 2,000 yards away, over a mile. Farther than most people could throw a rock with any accuracy, farther than most could see clearly with naked eyes. Master Sergeant Torres stood beside her, reading conditions through her spotting scope. "Winds gusting from the right, 8 to 12 miles per hour, Torres said quietly, her voice steady and professional. "Temperature 104. Mirage is moderate, creating about 2 moa of distortion. Humidity 17%. It's not ideal, Sarah." Sarah nodded once, not taking her eye from the scope. Ideal was a myth, a fantasy that existed only in climate-controlled ranges and computer simulations. Real shooting happened in chaos, wind that shifted every second, heat that bent light into lies, air that moved in invisible rivers and eddies. Montana had taught her that. Afghanistan had reinforced it. And now, in the Arizona desert with the world watching, she would prove it. She began her breathing sequence, the same pattern her father had taught her 25 years ago in those pine-covered mountains. Slow breath in through the nose, counting to 4, hold for 2. Slow breath out through the mouth, counting to 6. Her heart rate began to drop. 70 beats per minute, 65, 60. The rifle's reticle steadied, the tiny movements caused by her pulse becoming smaller, more predictable. Her mind began the calculations, running through numbers with the speed and precision of a computer. Distance: 2,000 yards, 6,000 feet, 1,828.8 meters. Bullet drop at that range with her ammunition, approximately 650 inches, over 54 feet of vertical drop. The bullet would arc through the sky like a miniature missile, climbing initially from the barrel's angle, then falling in a parabolic curve back to Earth. Wind drift. With a 10-mile-per-hour crosswind, the bullet would drift approximately 180 inches, 15 feet, to the left by the time it reached the target. But the wind wasn't steady at 10 miles per hour. It was gusting, fluctuating, moving in waves across the desert. She watched the wind flags at 500-yard intervals, seeing how they danced and shifted. Near the firing line, the wind was lighter, maybe 8 miles per hour. At 1,000 yards, the flags showed stronger gusts, perhaps 12. At the target, the flags indicated the wind was swirling, unpredictable. She'd have to average the conditions, make an educated guess about what the wind would be doing during the bullet's 3-second flight. Temperature at 104 degrees meant the air was less dense than standard conditions, which meant less drag on the bullet, which meant it would fly slightly faster and drop slightly less. But the heat also created mirage, the shimmering distortion caused by light bending through layers of air at different temperatures. The mirage made the target appear to move, to dance, to be in a slightly different position than it actually was. She'd have to compensate for that optical illusion. Altitude, 500 feet above sea level, which meant slightly less air density than sea level, another small factor in the bullet's trajectory. The Coriolis effect. At this latitude, shooting east to west, the Earth's rotation would cause the bullet to drift slightly, maybe 2 inches at this distance. Spin drift. Her barrel's rifling spun the bullet clockwise at 200,000 RPM, which would cause it to drift about 6 inches to the right over 2,000 yards. Every factor mattered. Every variable had to be accounted for. But beneath all the math, beneath all the science and calculation, there was something deeper, something her father had called the quiet place between heartbeats. It was the moment when all the knowledge became instinct, when the conscious mind stepped aside and let the subconscious take over. It was the place where great shooters lived, where the impossible became merely difficult, where 3 seconds of bullet flight compressed into a single moment of absolute certainty. Sarah found that place now. Her heart rate dropped below 50 beats per minute. Her breathing became so shallow it was almost imperceptible. The rifle was no longer something she was holding. It was an extension of her body, her will, her intention. The target in her scope stopped being a piece of paper 2,000 yards away and became the only thing that existed in the universe. Everything else, the crowd, the cameras, the pressure, the critics, the doubters, Derek Haynes with his smug smile, the 15 years of fighting to prove she belonged, all of it dissolved like smoke. In her mind, she heard her father's voice from that Montana morning so long ago. "Find that quiet place, baby girl. That's where the magic lives." She heard Chief Warrant Officer Pierce from Scout Sniper School. "You're going to have to prove yourself over and over again." She heard her own voice from Afghanistan, right before taking that 1,400-yard shot. Possible. Her finger found the trigger, resting on it with 2 pounds of pressure. The trigger brake was set at 4 pounds, which meant she needed 2 more pounds of steady, even pressure to fire. But she didn't think about that. She just waited, feeling the rhythm of her body, sensing the wind, reading the mirage. The moment would come. It always did. You couldn't force it. You could only recognize it and act. The wind flags at 1,000 yards straightened slightly, indicating a momentary lull. The mirage settled for just an instant. Her heartbeat reached that perfect pause between beats, that fraction of a second when the body achieves absolute stillness. The moment arrived. Sarah pressed the trigger. The rifle roared, a thunderclap that rolled across the desert like the voice of God. 12 pounds of recoil slammed into her shoulder with the force of a heavyweight punch, but she rode it, absorbing the impact through her stance, keeping her body stable, her eyes locked through the scope. The muzzle blast kicked up a cloud of dust in a 10-foot radius, and the concussion was so powerful that spectators standing 30 feet away felt it in their chests. The bullet left the barrel at 2,950 feet per second, over 2,000 miles per hour, more than twice the speed of sound. It was a 300-grain hollow-point boat tail, precision machined to tolerances measured in 10,000ths of an inch. It spun at 200,000 RPM, stabilized by the rifling in the barrel, cutting through the air with ballistic efficiency that would have impressed aerospace engineers. For 3 eternal seconds, the bullet flew. It climbed initially from the barrel's upward angle, reaching an apex about 200 yards downrange where it was nearly 8 feet above the line of sight. Then gravity took over, pulling it down in a graceful parabola. It flew through wind that pushed it sideways, through heat that distorted its path, through air that resisted its passage with every inch. It shed velocity constantly, 950 feet per second at the muzzle, 2,400 at 500 yards, 2,000 at 1,000 yards, 1,700 at 1,500 yards, and finally, as it approached the target, around 1,500 feet per second, subsonic, tumbling slightly, barely stable. The crowd held its breath. 600 people stood frozen, watching through binoculars and spotting scopes, willing the bullet to its target. The spotters in the observation tower tracked the impact point through high-powered optics, their fingers on the microphone button, ready to call the shot. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if nature itself was waiting to see what would happen. Sarah never took her eye from the scope. She watched the target, waiting for the impact, knowing before anyone else whether she'd made the shot. Time stretched out, elastic and surreal. 3 seconds felt like 3 hours, felt like 3 lifetimes of doubt and determination compressed into a single moment of truth. Then the target moved. It was a tiny movement, almost imperceptible at that distance, but Sarah saw it through her scope. The target paper jerked slightly as the bullet punched through. A fraction of a second later, the spotters' voices crackled over the loudspeaker system, trying to maintain professional composure but unable to hide their shock. Hit. A pause as they confirmed the location. 2 inches from dead center, new competition record. The explosion of sound was deafening. 600 people erupted simultaneously, a wave of noise that rolled across the desert like thunder. Screams, cheers, applause, shouts of disbelief. The American contingent went insane, Marines and Army personnel momentarily forgetting their rivalry to celebrate an American shooter making history. International competitors stood and applauded, recognizing excellence when they saw it. Media crews scrambled to capture reactions, cameras swinging wildly to catch the moment. But Sarah barely heard it. She lowered the rifle slowly, carefully, with the same precision she'd used to fire it. Her hands were perfectly steady, betraying none of the adrenaline that was surely coursing through her veins. She engaged the safety, then turned from the firing line, her face calm, almost serene. She'd known she would make it. She'd always known. Derek Haynes stood 20 feet away, frozen in place, his face cycling through emotions like a slot machine. Shock, disbelief, denial, and finally grudging respect. His mouth hung open slightly, his cocky smile completely erased. He'd shot an incredible 8 inches from center, a performance that should have made him the story of the day, the hero of the competition. Sarah had beaten him by 6 inches at a distance where 6 inches was the difference between good and legendary. The crowd was still roaring as Sarah walked past Haynes. She paused, turned to face him, and the cameras zoomed in, capturing every detail of the moment. The noise died down slightly as people realized something was about to happen. Sarah looked at Haynes with those gray Montana eyes, and a small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Right gun, sweetheart," she said, her voice quiet but crystal clear in the sudden hush. The crowd exploded again, this time with laughter mixed into the cheers. Haynes's face went red, then pale, then red again. He opened his mouth to respond, closed it, then opened it again. Finally, he just nodded, a tiny gesture of acknowledgement. He'd been beaten and he knew it. More importantly, everyone else knew it too. Sarah walked away, headed toward Master Sergeant Torres, who was grinning like she'd just won the lottery. Behind her, the announcer was reading the results, explaining that this was the longest confirmed hit from a standing position in competition history, that Sarah Mitchell had just rewritten the record books. But Sarah wasn't listening to any of that. She was thinking about her father in Montana, about every person who'd told her no, about every barrier that had been placed in her path. She'd taken the shot they said was impossible, and she'd made it look easy. That was all that mattered. The final scores were posted 30 minutes later, after the remaining shooters took their attempts at the 2,000-yard standing shot. None came close to Sarah's 2-inch grouping. The British sergeant, Aaron Walsh, who shot last, managed a respectable hit at 11 inches from center, but it wasn't enough. When the overall competition rankings flashed on the massive display screen, Sarah Mitchell's name sat at the top, 1,847 points, 3 points ahead of second place. She'd won, the first woman to ever claim the International Military Marksmanship Competition Championship. But that wasn't the story that would echo through history. The story was the shot, 2,000 yards standing unsupported, 2 inches from perfect center in gusting desert winds and brutal heat. Military marksmanship experts were already calling it one of the greatest shots ever recorded. Social media exploded with the video, the clip going viral within hours. The small female Marine with the massive rifle, the impossible distance, the 3-second wait, the eruption of celebration. Within 24 hours, it had 50 million views. The awards ceremony was held that evening under the massive tent, with industrial fans fighting their losing battle against the Arizona heat. Sarah stood on the highest podium, the American flag rising behind her while the national anthem played. She stood at attention, her hand over her heart, and thought about the journey that had brought her here. The 8-year-old girl in Montana learning to shoot tin cans. The teenager who decided to join the Marines against everyone's advice. The boot camp recruit who'd been forced to qualify 3 times because they couldn't believe she'd shot perfect scores. The captain who'd been rejected from Scout Sniper School 7 times before finally getting her chance. As the anthem's final notes faded, the competition director, Sir Malcolm Price, approached with the trophy, a bronze statue of a shooter in prone position, mounted on a marble base engraved with the names of every previous champion. All men until now. "Captain Mitchell," Price said, his British accent crisp and formal, "on behalf of the International Military Marksmanship Federation, it is my honor to present you with this trophy, and to congratulate you on a performance that will be studied and discussed for generations to come." The crowd applauded, but Sarah noticed something else. They were standing, all of them. 600 spectators, competitors, military brass from a dozen nations, even the media crews. A standing ovation that went on, wave after wave of applause that seemed to shake the tent itself. She saw tears on some faces. She saw women in the crowd, military spouses, female service members, young girls brought by their parents, crying openly, their hands pressed to their mouths in disbelief and joy. The speeches came next, but Sarah barely heard them. Officials praised the spirit of competition, the bonds between allied nations, the tradition of military marksmanship. Then they called her to the microphone for remarks. Sarah hadn't prepared anything. She'd been too focused on shooting to think about victory speeches. She stepped up to the podium, looked out at the sea of faces, and spoke from the heart. "I want to thank the Marine Corps for giving me this opportunity," she began, her voice steady despite the emotion churning inside her. "I want to thank my spotter, Master Sergeant Torres, who called the conditions perfectly. I want to thank my father, who taught me to shoot when I was 8 years old and never once told me I couldn't do something because I was a girl." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "But mostly, I want to say this. Today wasn't about proving that women can shoot. It was about proving that excellence has no gender. That if you work hard enough, train long enough, and refuse to accept other people's limitations, you can accomplish things people say are impossible." She looked directly at the cameras, knowing her words would be broadcast around the world. To every young girl watching this, wondering if she can serve her country, if she can compete at the highest levels, if she belongs in uniform, yes, you can. You do. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. And to everyone who doubted me, who said I was only here because of politics or diversity requirements or lowered standards, I hope you were watching, because that shot speaks louder than anything I could ever say. The crowd erupted again, but Sarah was done. She stepped away from the microphone and returned to her place on the podium. She'd said what needed saying. The work would speak for itself. Afterward, in the chaos of interviews and congratulations, Derek Haynes approached her. The swagger was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like humility. "Captain Mitchell," he said formally, extending his hand. I've never seen anything like that. How did you? He trailed off, genuinely at a loss for words. Sarah shook his hand, her grip firm. You want to know the secret, Derek? She paused, making sure he was listening. There is no secret, just 10,000 hours of practice, refusing to quit when everyone says you should, and choosing the right gun for the job. She smiled slightly. Also helps to have good fundamentals. Montana teaches you that. Haynes nodded slowly, processing this. I owe you an apology. What I said about the wrong gun, about you not being able to handle it. I was wrong. You're not just good, you're elite, top tier. I'd be honored to shoot with you anytime. I appreciate that, Sarah said. But Derek, don't apologize to me. Apologize to the next woman who shows up thinking she doesn't belong, and make sure she knows she does. The media circus continued for days. CNN ran features. Military Times published analysis of her shot, breaking down the ballistics and conditions. YouTube channels devoted to precision shooting created frame-by-frame breakdowns of her technique. The Marine Corps, sensing a public relations goldmine, wanted her to do a publicity tour. Sarah politely declined. I'm a shooter, not a celebrity, she told her commanding officer. Put me back to work. But the impact rippled outward in ways she couldn't control or predict. Within weeks, female enlistment in the Marines jumped 12%. Applications to Scout Sniper School from women increased dramatically. Shooting ranges across America reported more young girls showing up for lessons, often clutching printed pictures of Sarah making that historic shot. She'd become a symbol, an inspiration, proof that barriers were meant to be broken. 6 months later, Sarah was back at Quantico, teaching marksmanship to a new class of Marines. Among them were 3 women, the most the course had ever had at one time. They were nervous, intimidated, uncertain if they belonged. Sarah recognized that look. She'd worn it herself 15 years ago. Listen up, she told them on the first day. You're going to face doubt. You're going to face criticism. People are going to say you only made it because standards were lowered, or because of politics, or because of me. Ignore all of it. The only thing that matters is the shot. Make the shot, and everything else is just noise. One of the young women raised her hand. Ma'am, is it true you made a 2,000-yard shot standing up? Sarah smiled. Yes, and you know what? At one point in my life I thought that was impossible too. Then I stopped thinking about what was impossible and started thinking about what was necessary. The shot was necessary, so I made it. She paused, looking at each of them. You're going to be tempted to think your goals are impossible. Don't. Think of them as necessary. Then do the work. Years later, when military historians analyzed the International Military Marksmanship Competition of 2019, they would call Sarah Mitchell's 2,000-yard standing shot a watershed moment. Not just for women in the military, but for the sport of precision shooting itself. The shot had pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible, inspiring a new generation of shooters to attempt distances and positions previously thought unfeasible. But Sarah Mitchell herself saw it differently. To her, the shot wasn't about breaking records or making history. It was simpler than that. It was about a girl from Montana who'd learned to shoot tin cans with her father, who'd been told no 1,000 times and refused to accept it, who'd worked harder than anyone else because she had to, and who'd finally gotten the chance to show the world what she was capable of. The shot was about those 3 seconds between pulling the trigger and hearing hit. 3 seconds that represented 15 years of struggle and determination. It was about proving that excellence isn't determined by gender, only by dedication, skill, and the courage to step up to the line when everyone's watching, when failure means vindication for your critics, and success means carrying the weight of representation. Most of all, it was about the quiet place between heartbeats, the place her father had shown her in those Montana mountains, the place where magic lived. Sarah Mitchell had found that place on a blazing afternoon in the Arizona desert, with a rifle they said was wrong for her, at a distance they said was impossible, while the whole world watched. And she'd made it look easy. It never was, but that was the point. Nothing worth doing ever is. You do it anyway, you take the shot. You prove them wrong, and then if you're lucky, you inspire someone else to do the same. That was the real legacy of that 2,000-yard shot, not the record, not the trophy, not the headlines. It was the young girls who saw what was possible and decided to try. It was the barriers that crumbled a little more. It was the understanding, spreading slowly but inevitably through military culture and beyond, that talent recognizes no boundaries except the ones we impose on ourselves. Sarah Mitchell had taken the shot, and in doing so she'd opened the door for countless others to take theirs. In the end, that was all that mattered. The shot, the skill, and the courage to pull the trigger when everything's on the line. Right gun, sweetheart, right shot, right woman, right moment. Perfect.